Somewhere between the star charts I usually chase and the quiet streets outside my window, there is another kind of signal calling. Not a pulse from a distant neutron star, but a steady, living movement that repeats itself across seasons and centuries. It travels on wings and flippers, on hooves and hidden fins, on bodies the size of a paperclip, and bodies the size of a bus. Tonight, the trail is not a straight line, but a loop that closes itself again and again, like a careful signature. Tonight, our case file leads into animal migrations. Good evening, I'm Madeline Rowe, astrophysicist turned private eye, and I keep odd hours for odd mysteries. Most nights, I work with distant light, old photons that have been travelling longer than any story can hold. But every so often, a problem arrives from much closer, from the restless surface of Earth itself. A problem that moves and breathes and leaves a trail of timing, muscle, and weather behind it. Before we begin, settle in wherever you are. Let your shoulders drop by a fraction. Let your jaw unclench. Let the room do what rooms do at night, holding still, holding quiet, holding you. And if these slow, science-based case files help you drift off, you can always tap subscribe or follow, so you can find your way back on the next restless night. However, for the rest of this episode, there are no decisions to make at all. I turn on the small desk lamp beside my caseboard, the one with the shade that makes every page look a little softer at the edges. The city outside my window is reduced to a few distant sounds, a hush of tires, a far-off siren that never comes close. On my desk, a thick folder waits, heavy with maps and notes, and the kind of data that looks like art if you stop trying to rush it. On the tab, written in careful block letters, it says, Animal Migrations, and early in the file, I write it again, as if naming the thing makes it calmer. This is Animal Migrations for sleep. I slide the folder open, and the first page is not a photograph, but a definition, because science likes to begin by drawing the boundary lines. Migration is not just movement, not just travel, not just wandering until something good appears. Migration is a predictable, often seasonal movement between places, a movement that is repeated and shaped by selection, physiology, and memory. It is usually directional, usually timed, and often tied to the turning of the year, like a gear engaged with a larger machine. Sometimes it is a round trip, out and back, with the same body completing the loop. Sometimes it is a relay, with multiple generations carrying the route forward, like a message passed hand to hand. And sometimes it is a partial story, where some individuals move, and some remain, each strategy making sense in the math of their lives. I pause and listen to the quiet of the room. There is something soothing about beginning with the simplest truth, that migration is not a mythic urge in the abstract, but a behaviour with edges you can describe. Because there are other kinds of movement that look similar until you look closely. Dispersal, for instance, is the one-way leaving of home, the spreading out, the search for a new place to breed, often done once in a lifetime. Nomadism is different again, movement without a fixed destination, tracking resources that appear and vanish like weather. In eruptive years, a bird might flood south because food failed in the north, and the movement can be dramatic, even beautiful, but it is not always the same route, not always the same schedule. Migration, in the strict sense, is patterned patterned enough that the animal can be said to have a seasonal address book. On the next page, I find a small sketch of a clock, because timing is the first lock migration must pick. Animals do not simply leave because they feel like leaving. They leave because the costs and benefits of staying have shifted, and because they can sense those shifts in cues that have been reliable on average over evolutionary time. The most dependable cue on land is often day length, the photoperiod, a signal that does not lie even when weather does. A warm week in late winter can be a trick, but a shortening day in autumn is not. So many migrants use light as their calendar, letting a slow change in dusk and dawn tune hormones, appetite, restlessness, and the timing of departure. I turn the page and make a note in the margin, internal clocks, because a cue is not enough unless there is a mechanism to turn it into action. Many animals carry circannual rhythms, year-scale patterns in physiology that can persist even in constant conditions, like a metronome ticking behind the scenes. In birds, for instance, the body can begin preparing for migration before the landscape looks obviously different, because preparation takes time. Muscle must be tuned, fat stores built, feathers replaced, immune systems balanced, sleep altered, and the whole machine made ready for a long run. Even the brain participates, shifting attention and orientation toward a direction that is not yet visible from the ground. I lean back in my chair and let the idea settle, the way you let a cup of tea steep before you taste it. Migration is often described as a journey, but it is more like a series of decisions made with partial information, repeated across many individuals, producing a pattern you can trace on a map. And because it is decision-heavy, migration comes in different styles, different strategies, different compromises. In my folder, I have 3 broad labels, used by ecologists to keep the cabinet organised. Obligate migration, where essentially everyone in the population moves, because staying is too costly for too many. Facultative migration, where individuals can switch, migrating in some years and not in others, responding to conditions and opportunity. And eruptive migration, where movement erupts beyond the usual range, often driven by resource failures that ripple through the food web. There is another label that I like because it admits something human, something familiar, something like a divided plan. Partial migration means that within the same population, some individuals migrate while others remain resident. The same species, the same region, but different answers to the same question of winter, food, risk, and time. Often the differences are tied to age, sex, dominance, body condition, or local habitat quality. A strong individual may be able to hold a territory through the harsh months, while a weaker one gains more by leaving and returning later. Or the reverse, where the best individuals migrate because they can afford the travel cost and cash it in as early arrival on breeding grounds. I set my pen down and listen again, because the sounds of the house are good for pacing. A small click from the heater, a settling pipe. In the quiet, I let myself picture the shape of a year from an animal's perspective, not as a calendar on a wall, but as a moving boundary of safe and unsafe, rich and poor, possible and impossible. Migration, at heart, is a way to live in more than one season, without having to endure all of them in one place. I return to the file and find a map, a familiar style, thin lines across continents like a spiderweb drawn with care. This is where patterns appear, and patterns are what a private eye lives for. Some migrants move in a chain, with northern breeders wintering just south of them, and more southern breeders wintering farther south still, like a set of stacked ribbons. Some move in a leapfrog pattern, where the individuals breeding farthest north winter farthest south, vaulting over the others as if trading places at the edge of the world. And some routes telescope, compressing and expanding with geography, because coastlines, mountains, and resource patches act like funnels in a moving landscape. There are also migratory divides, places where one population splits into two directions, east and west, like a fork in the road that has existed long enough to shape genes and culture. Two groups, two wintering grounds, two bundles of hazards, and sometimes two different timelines of arrival back to the breeding places. From above, the world looks open. From within a body, it is a corridor problem. A migration route is not an abstract line. It is a sequence of places that must exist at the right times. I take a slow breath and flip to a page titled Costs and Benefits, the sort of page that tries to reduce wonder to arithmetic and somehow makes it more wondrous anyway. The benefits of migration are often simple to say and hard to fulfill. Follow the food, avoid scarcity, escape parasites and pathogens that build up in dense resident populations. Reduce competition by moving into seasonally empty habitats. Time reproduction to the brief window when the world is most generous to growing young. In the Arctic, for example, summer is a sudden, bright surge of life, a pulse that rewards those who arrive on time and punishes those who miss it. But the costs are written just as clearly in the margins of every tracking record. Travel costs energy, sometimes in spectacular amounts. Travel costs time, and time is the currency of breeding success when the season is short. Travel costs safety, because movement exposes an animal to unfamiliar predators, storms, fatigue, and the simple hazard of being in the open when you would otherwise be sheltered. And travel costs opportunity, because while you are in transit, you are not feeding in the richest patches, not defending territory, not caring for young, not resting deeply. I like this part of the file, because it treats migration as a trade-off, not a fairy tale. When we speak softly about instinct, it can sound like an answer that ends curiosity. In reality, migration is a set of evolved solutions that must be re-earned in each generation through learning, physiology, and survival. Even when a route is innate in a broad sense, the details are tuned by experience and circumstance. A headwind changes the plan. A drought changes the plan. A late snow changes the plan. A single storm can carve a new branch into a flyway, if enough individuals are pushed and enough survive to repeat it. On the next page, I find the word orientation, and below it a smaller word, navigation, as if the author wants to be precise about what is being claimed. Orientation is knowing which way to go, a compass direction, a bearing, a heading. Navigation, in the stronger sense, is knowing where you are relative to a goal, as if the animal carries a map and can correct course when displaced. Some migrants show remarkable orientation without needing a full map. Others, especially those that return to the same breeding sites or the same river mouth with uncanny accuracy, suggest more complex spatial information at work. I take a sip of water and let the next section roll out slowly, because this is where the case file becomes a cabinet of invisible tools. First, the sun compass. If you can see the sun, you can use it as a reference, but only if you can compensate for the fact that it moves across the sky. That means pairing a solar cue with an internal clock, so that morning sun and afternoon sun do not produce contradictory instructions. Then, the star compass. At night, some birds learn the rotation pattern of the sky and can orient using stellar cues, treating the night as a rotating dome with a stable center. Then, the magnetic compass. Earth itself provides a field with direction and inclination, and many animals can sense aspects of it, using it as a backup or even a primary guide when the sky is hidden. There are other cues too, quieter ones that do not look like compasses until you learn to read them. Polarized light patterns at dusk and dawn can offer directional information even when the sun is low or obscured. Odors can form regional signatures, especially over ocean and coastline, where wind carries a chemical story about land, algae, and temperature. Landmarks can anchor a route, not as a full map, but as a chain of familiar shapes that mean keep going, keep going, keep going. And in some systems, sound may matter, including low-frequency cues that travel far, making the world feel textured even in darkness and fog. I turn to a page with a simple note that reads, not one cue, but many. Because the most robust navigation systems are redundant. A migrant that relies on only one signal can be fooled by weather, dust, haze, or the bright confusion of human lights. A migrant with layered cues can cross-check, correct, and continue. And layered cues also explain why the same species can migrate under very different conditions, over desert, over sea, through cloud, through night, and still arrive where the year asks them to arrive. I place a paperweight on the file so the pages do not curl, and I let my eyes drift to the track lines printed on the next sheet. They look like threads, and in a way they are threads sewing together parts of the planet that might otherwise feel separate. This is the beauty of migration at the largest scale, that it creates connectivity, linking distant ecosystems through the bodies of animals that travel between them. A shorebird feeds in one hemisphere and carries energy, nutrients, and even microscopic hitchhikers to another. A salmon grows in the ocean and returns upstream, delivering marine nutrients into forested watersheds. A whale dives deep and surfaces to defecate near the top, moving nutrients upward and sideways, a biological pump with a heartbeat. But a case file is not complete without method, without how we know what we say we know. So I turn to the section that smells faintly of electronics and field notebooks, the section titled Tracking and Markers. Long ago, much of migration science relied on banding and recovery, tiny rings and patient waiting, learning from the few individuals that were seen again. It was slow, and it was biased toward places where humans look, and toward animals that cross human paths. Then came radar, which revealed that the night sky can be full of migrants even when the ground seems still, a moving weather of wings. Then came satellite tags, GPS loggers, light-level geolocators, and acoustic arrays, each one a different kind of lantern held up to the dark. Some tools are extrinsic, attached to the animal, collecting a breadcrumb trail of locations or movements. Some tools are intrinsic, carried within the animal's tissues, a chemical or genetic record of where it has been. Stable isotopes, for instance, vary geographically in predictable ways, and those variations can be incorporated into feathers, hair, claws, or other tissues as they grow. When you analyze the isotopic signature in a feather, you can often infer something about where that feather was formed, where the bird was feeding when it grew that material. It is not a GPS coordinate, but it is a fingerprint, and fingerprints are useful when the trail is otherwise invisible. I let that thought settle gently, because there is something satisfying about the idea that a journey can be written into a body, quietly, without drama. That the chemistry of rain, the geology of a region, the plants at the base of a food web can become part of an animal's tissues, and later become data on my desk. This is how science turns the outdoors into a readable archive. Not by taking the wonder away, but by giving the wonder a way to leave evidence behind. Now, on my desk, I spread out 3 maps and place them in a rough triangle, like a detective arranging photographs. The first map is breeding grounds. The second is non-breeding grounds, the overwintering places or dry season refugees, depending on the system. The third is the migration route itself, the in-between world where stopovers and bottlenecks live. When these 3 maps are linked, we call it migratory connectivity, the degree to which individuals from one breeding area associate with particular non-breeding areas. Strong connectivity means a tight link, like a specific hometown tied to a specific winter neighbourhood. Weak connectivity means mixing, a looser association with individuals from many breeding places sharing the same winter grounds and vice versa. Connectivity matters because threats are not evenly distributed. If a population has strong connectivity and its winter habitat is degraded, the breeding population can crash even if breeding habitat is intact. If connectivity is weak, the risk may be spread, but new challenges appear, such as shared disease exposure or competition in crowded wintering areas. This is why modern migration ecology often insists on the whole annual cycle, not just the season that is easiest to study or most visible. I glance at the clock and see that time is doing what it always does, slipping forward without apology. But we are in no hurry tonight. We can take each idea like a slow footstep across a dark room. So I turn to the next part of the file, the part with the small photographs that field researchers love, animals caught in motion, but framed in a way that suggests patience rather than speed. There is a shorebird on one page, a species that treats the globe like a series of stepping stones. Long-distance migrants often rely on stopovers, places to rest and refuel, and these places can be as critical as the endpoints. A stopover is not a break from migration, it is part of migration, as essential as any wing beat over open water. In many birds, the ability to rapidly accumulate fat at a stopover is a key adaptation, a way to convert a brief abundance into stored energy that can be carried across scarcity. Fat is not a moral word in biology. Fat is fuel. Fat is distance. Fat is time purchased in advance. I follow that thread into physiology, because the body is always the true protagonist in any migration story. Migrants often enter a state of hyperphagia before departure, increasing food intake and shifting metabolism towards storage. Muscles may change and organs may adjust, because carrying extra mass is expensive, but running out of fuel mid-journey is worse. Some birds even shrink digestive organs during non-stop flights, reducing the cost of carrying unused capacity, then rebuild those organs upon landing and feeding again. It is a temporary redesign, the body becoming a vehicle for a specific phase of life, then retooling itself for the next phase when it arrives. Sleep, too, becomes flexible during migration, because the need to travel can compress the need for long rest. Some animals use brief bouts of rest, micro-sleeps, or altered sleep patterns that maintain function under unusual schedules. Others time migration to favourable winds, travelling when conditions lower the energetic cost, then resting when the atmosphere turns against them. The air itself can be an ally, a moving river that rewards patience and punishes haste. And of course, migration does not belong only to the air. I slide a new photograph onto the centre of my desk, a marine animal surfaced in a dark sea, its body partly silvered by moonlight. In the ocean, roots are shaped by currents, temperature gradients, and food blooms that rise and fade with seasons and sunlight. A whale might travel between high-latitude feeding grounds, rich in summer productivity, and low-latitude breeding grounds, where calves can be born in warmer, calmer water. A sea turtle might follow coastlines and currents, using geomagnetic cues and learned landmarks to return to nesting beaches after years away. A fish might treat a river mouth as a home address, leaving to grow in the open sea and returning with astonishing precision, guided by scent and geomagnetic information. As I read, the case file shifts from a set of definitions to a gallery of strategies, each one a different answer to the same problem. How do you live on a planet where resources move in time as much as in space? Where the best place in June is a dangerous place in January? Where reproduction is a narrow window and survival is a long negotiation with cold, heat, hunger, and risk? I turn to a section that is smaller, tucked between larger chapters, but it might be my favourite because it hides in plain sight. It is titled Daily Migration, and it describes a movement that happens not once a year, but every day, like a heartbeat. In the ocean, countless small animals perform diel vertical migration, rising towards the surface at night to feed and sinking deeper during the day to avoid predators and harsh light. It is one of the largest mass movements on Earth by biomass, an invisible tide of living bodies shifting up and down through the water column. Here, the compass is not north and south, but light and darkness, and the route is measured in meters rather than continents. I let that sink in, the idea of a planet layered with migrations at different scales. Some you see from a cliff, some only from a sonar screen, some only from a statistical model that notices the repeating pulse. Large migrations are dramatic, but small migrations are constant, and constancy has its own softness. The day-night cycle itself becomes a schedule that animals exploit, and when you broaden your definition of migration to include these daily vertical journeys, the world feels even more alive, even in darkness. Back on land, the file brings me north into seasonal extremes, where the logic of migration becomes almost inevitable. At high latitudes, the environment changes rapidly and profoundly across the year, with long winters that constrict food availability and summers that explode with plant growth and insect abundance. In such systems, seasonal migration can be a way to connect a winter refuge with a summer feast, to stitch together two places that each offer something essential, but not at the same time. Caribou, for instance, can move across vast landscapes, tracking green up and avoiding insect harassment, balancing food quality, predator risk, and energy expenditure as they go. Birds arrive to breed during the brief northern summer, timing their reproduction to the peak of resources that will feed their chicks, then departing before the world shuts down again. Timing, again, is everything. If spring arrives earlier, the peak of insects may shift. If snow melts later, access to ground nesting sites may be delayed. If storms intensify along the route, the energetic cost of travel may rise and survival may fall. Migration is not only a route problem, but a schedule problem, and schedules are sensitive to change when the world's cues are shifting. I turn to a page where the author has drawn a simple curve, a resource pulse rising and falling, and beneath it a thin line representing a migrant trying to match it. This is often called phenological matching, and it is central to understanding why some populations struggle under climate change. If the migrant's timing is controlled strongly by photoperiod, and the resource peak is controlled strongly by temperature, the two can drift apart. a bird can arrive on the historical schedule and find that the best food moment has already passed, leaving chicks to grow in a world that is less generous than expected. In that gap, survival and reproduction can change, and over time, populations can decline even without obvious habitat loss at the endpoints. The file is careful not to make dramatic claims without evidence, but it does not need drama to feel important. A small mismatch in timing can have large effects when it repeats across years. A stopover wetland that dries a little earlier can reduce refueling success for thousands of migrants who depend on it. A shift in wind patterns can change the cost of crossing a sea, turning a once manageable route into a more hazardous one. And because migrants link places, a problem in one location can echo across distant regions, like a delayed signal travelling through a network. I rest my hands flat on the desk for a moment, grounding myself, and I let the case file's tone guide mine. Hard science does not have to be loud. It can be steady, like a metronome, like a tide. So I continue, moving deeper into the file's middle, where the pages grow thick with examples, each one a gentle demonstration of principle. There is a section on insects, and I smile a little because it is easy to forget that migration is not only the realm of large, charismatic animals. Insects can migrate in huge numbers, using wind assistance, altitude selection, and seasonal timing to move across regions in ways that are both fragile and robust. Some insect migrations are multi-generational, with no single individual completing the entire circuit, but the population as a whole maintaining the loop over time. A route can be held in genes and in emergent behaviour, in responses to cues like day length, temperature, and host plant availability. The scale is different, but the logic is similar. Move to where conditions allow survival and reproduction, and do it with enough predictability that the strategy can persist. In another section, the file returns to birds, because birds offer an unusual advantage to scientists. They are visible in ways many other migrants are not, and they can carry devices that record movement in fine detail. A light-level geolocator can infer approximate latitude and longitude from day length and the timing of sunrise and sunset. A GPS tag can provide precise tracks, revealing stopover duration, route choice, and responses to weather systems. Radar can reveal the broad flow of migration, the density of travellers, the altitude of flight, and the sudden surges that occur on favourable nights. When you combine these tools, you can see migration not as a single line, but as a dynamic process, a set of decisions made by thousands of individuals under changing conditions. I take a breath and let a softer scene unfold around the facts, because my job tonight is not only to explain, but to help you drift. The desk lamp hums faintly. The folder pages whisper when I turn them. Outside, the night keeps its distance, and inside this quiet, I trace a route with my finger across a map, not because I need to solve anything urgently, but because tracing is soothing, from north to south, from coast to coast, from river to ocean, from darkness to the first thin light of spring. In the margin of one page, I find a reminder. Migration is shaped by wind, water, and topography. Routes are not chosen in a vacuum. They are constrained by geography and by the physics of movement. A mountain range can be a wall, a funnel, or a lift, depending on species and weather. A desert can be a barrier that demands a long non-stop crossing, or a corridor that can be crossed in stages if oases exist at the right spacing. An ocean can be a smooth highway for a seabird that can rest on waves and feed on the move, or an unbroken hazard for a small passerine that must carry every ounce of fuel from shore to shore. Stopovers, again, return as a central theme because they are where the long journey becomes possible. A migrant does not need a perfect world, but it needs a chain of adequate moments. A wetland that holds insects at the right week. A coastal flat exposed at low tide with enough invertebrates to refill a fat store quickly. A forest patch with fruit at the right phase of ripeness. A sheltered bay with prey density high enough to justify slowing down for a while. This is why habitat loss along migration routes can be so damaging even when breeding sites look protected on paper. A missing link breaks the chain, and the chain is often more fragile than we notice because the most important stopovers are not always the largest or the most famous, but the ones that align with the physiology and timing of the traveller. A stopover is a match between what the animal needs and what the place offers in a narrow slice of time. Lose the timing and the place is still there, but it no longer functions as the same support. I reach a section where the file grows more modern, more concerned with the way human infrastructure intersects with migration routes. Light pollution can alter nocturnal orientation, drawing birds into cities where glass and exhaustion increase mortality. Wind turbines can pose collision risk, especially in certain topographic funnels, though careful siting and curtailment strategies can reduce impacts. Dams can block fish migrations, turning ancient routes into dead ends unless fish passages or dam removals restore connectivity. Fishing gear can entangle or incidentally capture migrating marine animals, adding a hazard that did not exist in the deep history of the route. And landscapes that once offered continuous habitat can become patchwork, forcing migrants to navigate not only seasons, but fragmentation. Still, the file is not pessimistic. Science rarely is, because science is a method for seeing problems clearly, and clarity creates options. When we can map routes, identify bottlenecks, and quantify connectivity, we can design conservation that matches the structure of the system. Protect a breeding ground, and you protect a season. Protect a stopover, and you protect a journey. Protect a wintering ground, and you protect survival that makes breeding possible at all. And when we think in the language of networks, we can prioritize the nodes that carry the most flow, the places where small protections yield large benefits. I set the conservation pages aside for a moment and return to the basic mechanics, because the simplest questions are often the most soothing to answer slowly. How does an animal decide to leave? Partly through cues like day length, temperature, rainfall, and food availability. Partly through internal state, like body condition, fat reserves, hormone levels, and readiness of muscles and feathers. Partly through social information, watching what others do, especially in species where experience can be shared or copied. And partly through inherited programs that bias a direction and a timing window, even before the animal has personal knowledge of the route. Then, how does an animal choose the route? Routes can be shaped by prevailing winds, by food patches, by safety, by geography, and by history. Some migrants follow coastlines because coastlines reduce the risk of being far from land and provide frequent feeding opportunities. Some cut straight across seas to save distance, accepting risk in exchange for time gained. Some follow rivers and mountain valleys, using them as natural corridors with predictable resources. And some routes are partly inherited and partly learned, refined each year by experience, like a path worn smoother by repeated footsteps. Then, how does an animal know when to stop? Stop decisions can be triggered by exhaustion, by reaching a familiar refueling site, by encountering favourable habitat, or by weather that makes continued travel inefficient or unsafe. A headwind can turn a good plan into a bad one, and waiting can be the most adaptive move available. A tailwind can turn an ordinary night into a gift, and migrants often surge forward under favourable conditions, concentrating movement into pulses you can see on radar. The journey is not constant motion, it is motion punctuated by stillness, and the stillness is part of the strategy. Now, the file offers me a small story, one that is really a case study of physiology. A long-distance flyer prepares by storing fat, sometimes nearly doubling body mass before a major crossing. During flight, it burns fuel and produces metabolic water, a hidden benefit of fat that helps maintain hydration when fresh water is not available. The bird's heart and flight muscles work continuously, and efficiency matters because small percentage differences in cost per kilometre add up to life or death over oceans and deserts. Upon landing, the bird may feed intensely, then rest, then feed again, converting local insects or invertebrates into the next leg of the journey. When you read the data carefully, you can see the body as a budget, income and expense, managed with exquisite precision under variable conditions. I think about budgets for a moment, because budgets are a kind of comfort. A budget implies rules, constraints, balance. Even when the world is uncertain, a migrating animal is not only reacting, it is operating within a set of evolved rules that usually work well enough to persist. That persistence across generations, across climatic cycles, across shifting landscapes, is part of what makes migration feel like an old story with new pages added each year. The case file returns me to partial migration, and I linger there because it is such a gentle reminder that nature rarely offers only one way to be successful. In some populations, residents gain the advantage of familiarity, holding territories and knowing local food patches intimately. Migrants, meanwhile, may avoid harsh conditions and return in better condition, or return earlier to claim resources, depending on the system. Partial migration can be maintained if each strategy has a context where it pays, and if the balance shifts with density, weather, and competition. A crowded habitat might make migration more attractive because competition is intense. A mild winter might make residency more attractive because the costs of staying are reduced. Over time, the population can behave like a portfolio, spreading risk across strategies, not by planning, but by selection and plasticity acting through individuals. I let my eyes drift to the edge of the desk where a small globe sits, the kind with slightly faded colours, more decorative than accurate. I spin it slowly with one finger, watching continents blur into each other. The globe is a toy representation of a planet that is, in reality, stitched together by movement. And migration is one of the stitches, binding distant regions into a functional whole, carrying energy and information from one season to the next. Now the file takes a turn into the way scientists build evidence from many imperfect signals, and I find that soothing too, because no single method sees everything. A GPS tag can be precise, but it may be limited to larger animals or a small sample size. A geolocator can be light and cheap enough for smaller birds, but it requires recapture, and the location estimates are broader. Radar sees mass movement, but not individual identity. Stable isotopes provide geographic inference, but with uncertainty and overlap between regions. Genetics can reveal population structure and historical connectivity, but it doesn't always resolve fine-scale seasonal links. So researchers combine methods, building a picture the way you build a constellation from points of light, not claiming more precision than the data allow, but still seeing a coherent pattern emerge. I like the humility of that approach. It mirrors the way the night itself works, never showing the whole landscape at once, but revealing enough to move safely if you go slowly. And tonight, slow is exactly what we are doing. We are letting the science unfold at a pace the nervous system can accept without bracing. I turn to a fresh page and begin a new note, written as if it is a clue in a case. Clue 1. Migration is often a solution to seasonality. Clue 2. Migration requires timing mechanisms, orientation mechanisms, and physiological preparation. Clue 3. Migration creates connectivity, linking ecosystems and making conservation a whole year problem rather than a single season one. Clue 4. Migration routes are corridors shaped by geography, weather, and history, and their weakest links are often stopover sites. Clue 5. Migration is changing as the world's cues and habitats change, and those changes can ripple through populations in subtle but consequential ways. I read the clues back to myself and feel the quiet satisfaction of a tidy summary, because summaries are a kind of lullaby for the analytical mind. When the mind knows it will be reminded of the main points, it can let go of the need to hold every detail tightly. So if you feel yourself drifting, it is safe to drift. The case file will still be here when you resurface, and the story will still make sense. Now, I open another subsection of the folder, one that focuses on the northern latitudes, because the north exaggerates seasonality until it becomes a clean laboratory for understanding movement. In the far north, the calendar is not subtle. Winter is long and austere, with food scarcity and darkness pressing down like a heavy coat. Then summer arrives, sudden and bright, with plants racing upward and insects filling the air, and the entire system becomes briefly abundant. For many species, the best strategy is to arrive for that pulse, exploit it for growth and reproduction, then leave before the pulse collapses. This is why northern migration can be viewed as a way of renting an ecosystem for a season, taking advantage of its productivity without paying the full cost of its winter. The file reminds me that seasonality is not only temperature, it is light, and snow cover, and predator behavior, and ice formation, and the timing of plant phenology. In Arctic marine systems, ice can act as both barrier and habitat, shaping where prey concentrates and where predators can hunt. In tundra systems, snow depth can control access to forage and influence where herbivores choose to move. And because these factors vary across landscapes, a migration route is often less a straight arrow and more a broad front, a swath of movement that shifts with local conditions. I close my eyes briefly and let the image rest there, a broad front of animals moving through a landscape that is itself changing day by day. Then I look again, and the file offers another quiet concept, one I've seen in other sciences too. It is the idea of surfing a wave. On land, some herbivores time their migration to follow the green wave, tracking the progression of fresh plant growth as spring advances across latitude and altitude. Fresh growth can be more nutritious and easier to digest, and by moving with the wave, an herbivore can prolong access to high-quality forage. In this way, migration can be a strategy for maximizing food quality rather than simply food quantity. The route becomes a way to stay in the best part of the season longer, like walking alongside the edge of a sunrise that keeps moving ahead. In the air, a similar logic can apply, but with winds and weather systems. A migrant that departs into favourable winds can reduce energy costs, increase speed, and shorten time spent exposed to hazards. A migrant that waits, even for days, can reap a large reward if conditions improve. Waiting is not failure. Waiting is strategy. Waiting is part of the movement ecology of animals that cannot control the atmosphere, but can learn to work with it. At this point in the file, the pages begin to feel gently repetitive, and repetition is good for sleep. The same themes return at different scales, in different species, through different mechanisms, as if nature is practicing variations on a melody. Timing, orientation, fuel, stopovers, connectivity, trade-offs. So I let the next section unfold like a slow walk down a hallway of cabinets, each drawer labelled with a different kind of migrant. I pull the drawer for fish first, because rivers are such clear corridors, and corridors make the logic visible. Anadromous fish grow in the ocean and return to fresh water to spawn, reversing the direction of many other species' life histories. Catadromous fish do the opposite, growing in fresh water and migrating to the sea to reproduce, as eels do in some systems. These life histories link habitats across salinity gradients, and they require navigation across chemical, physical, and hydrological transitions that are anything but simple. A salmon's return is often guided by olfaction, learning the chemical signature of its natal stream, then using that signature as a final address as it approaches home. And all of it depends on connectivity, because a blocked river is not simply a barrier in space, but a severed link in a life cycle that spans ecosystems. I close the fish drawer and open the mammal drawer, where migrations can be visible even to casual observers. Large herbivores can move across landscapes tracking rainfall and plant growth, moving between dry season refuges and wet season feeding grounds. Predators can follow those herbivores, synchronizing their own movements with prey distributions, creating a multi-species choreography driven by energy flow. In marine mammals, the pattern often links high-latitude feeding to low-latitude breeding, a separation of foraging and reproduction that can reduce predation risk for calves and align energy acquisition with seasonal productivity. The body, again, is the organizer, allocating resources between survival and reproduction across space and time. Then I open the bird drawer, because birds, for all their familiarity, still carry some of the most extreme migration performances known. Long-distance shorebirds can complete non-stop flights that require precise fueling and favourable winds, crossing oceans and deserts in a single push when conditions align. Other birds migrate in shorter hops, using a chain of stopovers, integrating local resource availability into the rhythm of the journey. Some species migrate at night when the air is cooler and calmer and predation risk may be reduced, using stellar and magnetic cues to orient under a dark dome of sky. Some migrate during the day, using thermals and updrafts to reduce energy costs, spiraling upward and gliding forward, treating the atmosphere as a landscape with hills and valleys of lift. At the bottom of the bird drawer is a quiet reminder written in pencil: juveniles and experience. In many species, young birds may migrate without adults, guided by inherited directional programs, yet refined by learning and environmental feedback. In others, social learning is more direct, with juveniles following experienced individuals, learning routes, stopovers, and timing through association. This matters because it means migration routes can have a cultural component, not in the human sense, but in the sense that information can persist through learning across generations. When populations decline and experienced individuals are lost, root knowledge can erode, and the system can become more fragile, especially in long-lived species where the journey is complex. I let the pencil note sit there, soft and serious. Then I continue, because the next part of the case file turns towards the future without raising its voice. The future of migration is not one future, but many, varying by species, region, and the kind of change occurring. Some species may shift timing earlier or later if their cues allow flexibility, and if selection favours new schedules. Some may shift routes, tracking habitat changes or altering stopovers in response to drought, development, or changing wind regimes. Some may shorten migration distance if winters become milder and residency becomes more feasible, increasing the prevalence of partial migration or changing it toward more residency. Others may be forced into longer or riskier journeys if suitable habitat moves poleward or becomes more fragmented, raising costs and reducing survival. This is why, in the quiet language of ecology, people speak of vulnerability in terms of constraints and dependencies. A migrant that depends on a small number of key stopovers can be vulnerable if those sites are lost or degraded. A migrant that depends on narrow timing windows can be vulnerable if resource peaks shift outside those windows. A migrant with strong connectivity can be vulnerable if one linked region faces severe habitat change. A migrant with flexible routes and broad diet may be more resilient, though resilience is never a guarantee, only a tendency shaped by biology and context. I set the folder down for a moment and look at the lamp's pool of light on the desk. It reminds me of a stopover, a small safe patch in a large dark landscape. You are in your own stopover right now, a pocket of rest, a temporary refuge that lets your nervous system refuel. Your only task is to be here, to let the words pass over you like a mild wind, to let your thoughts settle into the corners where they belong. When I pick up the folder again, I turn to the last pages, the ones that often contain the practical conclusions a detective would write down before closing a case. If we want migration to persist, we must protect not only destinations, but pathways. We must keep key stopovers intact, maintain connectivity for river systems, reduce unnecessary hazards like excessive nighttime lighting and poorly sited barriers, and coordinate conservation across borders because migration does not recognise political lines. We must also keep improving our ability to measure migration because measurement reveals which links matter most and which interventions offer the best return for effort. And we must remember that migration is an annual cycle phenomenon, a story told across seasons, and any one chapter is incomplete without the others. Now, as the case file comes to a gentle close, I return to the beginning, to the simplest image that started this night. A loop, a signature, a route traced through air and water and land, repeated until it becomes part of the planet's quiet character. In my mind, I see the routes not as frantic lines, but as calm paths, as if the world is teaching itself to breathe in patterns. North in spring, south in autumn, up at night, down in the day, out to feed, back to breed. I close the folder and rest my hand on it for a moment, like you might rest your palm on a book before returning it to a shelf. Outside, the city continues its low murmur, but it feels farther away now, softened by the steady cadence of the story. Inside, the desk lamp continues to glow, patient and small, a lighthouse for a quiet mind. And if sleep arrives while these routes are still unfolding in your thoughts, that is perfectly fine. The journeys will continue without you needing to hold them. They have been continuing for a long time, and they will keep tracing their lines across the moving planet, quietly, reliably, one season into the next. If you are still awake, I will stay with you a little longer, letting the case file linger in gentle detail, like a slow pan across a map. I will walk once more through the cabinet of migrations, not as a list, but as a soft spiral back through the same ideas, turning them into a rhythm your mind can set down. Because repetition is kind, and kind is good for sleep. I return to the first drawer again, the one labelled timing, and I open it slowly. Day length changes by seconds each day, and those seconds add up, and animals can sense the accumulation as if the planet is turning a dial in the background. Photoreceptors and hormonal pathways translate light into internal state, preparing the body before the landscape becomes obviously different. In spring, that preparation can mean readiness to breed, readiness to travel, readiness to exploit a resource pulse that will not wait. In autumn, it can mean a shift toward storage, toward departure, toward a quieter season where survival becomes the main objective. And because day length is reliable, it provides a stable scaffold for timing, even when weather fluctuates unpredictably. Then I open the next drawer, the one labelled orientation, and I let the tools sit on the table in front of me like evidence bags. A sun compass paired with an internal clock. A star compass learned from the rotating sky. A magnetic sense that provides direction even through cloud and darkness. Polarized light at twilight, a subtle pattern in the sky. Odor landscapes and coastal signatures. Landmarks that become familiar in the way a street corner becomes familiar when you have walked it many times. No single tool is perfect, but together they form a navigation kit that can function under changing conditions. Next, I open the drawer labelled fuel, and the smell of fieldwork rises, a mix of sea air and mudflat, and the sharp note of a lab solvent used to analyse lipids. Migrants store energy in forms that are efficient for transport, and their bodies shift into a mode that prioritises travel readiness. The liver, the muscles, the fat stores, the endocrine system, each one playing a role in an orchestrated preparation. When departure comes, it is not spontaneous. It is the end of a preparation phase that has been building quietly, sometimes for weeks. And when the journey begins, the body becomes a moving engine, converting stored energy into motion while minimizing waste, managing heat, and maintaining function across long durations. Then, softly, I open the drawer labelled stopovers, and I let myself stay there for a while, because stopovers are the calmest part of migration ecology to think about. A stopover is a place that says, you can pause here. You can feed here, you can rest here, you can let your muscles recover and your fuel stores rise again. Stopovers are often wetlands, coastlines, forest patches, river bends, sheltered bays, places where food concentrates predictably at the right times. And because migrants are often synchronized, stopovers can become crowded, turning them into hotspots of interaction, competition, and sometimes disease transmission, all of which matter for population dynamics. Finally, I open the drawer labelled connectivity, and the maps appear again, breeding places linked to wintering places, linked by corridors of movement and time. Connectivity is the reason a local conservation action can have distant benefits, and also the reason a distant problem can show up as a local decline. It is the network logic of ecology, and once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. In rivers, in flyways, in ocean currents, in the daily vertical shifts of small organisms that move nutrients through the water column. I close the cabinet in my mind and return to my desk, where the folder sits quietly, no longer needing my attention in the urgent way a crime scene might. This case file is not about a single culprit or a single solution. It is about a living pattern that emerges when many organisms solve the same seasonal problem with different bodies and different tools. And the more carefully you look, the more you see that migration is not an exception in nature, but a common response to a world that changes predictably in time. A moving world produces moving lives, and those moving lives, in turn, shape the world, linking ecosystems and transporting energy and information across vast distances. Now I let the lamp's light dim a little, just by shifting the shade, not by changing the bulb, the way you might soften a scene without altering it entirely. I breathe in slowly and out slowly, and I let the last thought of the night be simple and steady. There are routes written across this planet that no road builder ever planned. Routes written in timing, in physiology, in the quiet geometry of corridors and stopovers. Routes repeated until they become as real as rivers. And tonight, you do not need to follow any of them. You can let them run on without you, while you rest, while you drift, while your own body chooses stillness and sleep.